Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election once again, and we'll be talking about how each and every state, as well as a handful of congressional districts, in the cases of Maine and Nebraska, trended relative to the country. Now, I'm going to say this up front right at the beginning of the video I'm going to get comments, but before too many people comment this is not a swing map. This is a trend map. So let's begin this video by differentiating between the two. A swing map is simpler. It is just it's simple math. It's just the margin in a given state between two elections. So if Joe Biden won a state by 7.3% in 2020 and Kamala Harris won it by 8.5% in 2024, that is a 1.2% swing towards Kamala Harris. It's just, you're basically doing basic subtraction or addition. And so that is simpler. And if you were looking at a swing map, every single state on this map would be red. Even Washington, which trended the most towards Kamala Harris on this map, she still did around a point worse than Joe Biden in. Now, a trend map is a bit more nuanced, and there are, there's some good, some bad, and I'll talk about that after this. But a trend map just measures how each state voted relative to the popular vote in a given election. So let's say Georgia. Georgia was won by Joe Biden by 0.2% in a year where the country voted for Joe Biden by 4.5%. So Georgia voted 4.3% to the right of the country because Biden won it by 4.3% less than he won the country as a whole by. Donald Trump won Georgia by 2%, by 2.0% roughly. And he won the popular vote by 1.5%. So Georgia voted only half a point to the right of the country. So even though Donald Trump won Georgia in 2024 but lost in 2020, it trended relative to the country a couple points towards the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris, relative to the country, did better in Georgia than Joe Biden did. And that might sound a little weird, obviously, and again, we'll talk about what this all means in a second, but that is the kind of the rule of trends. It's the rule of how, how generally speaking, a state, or you can do it for a district or a county, voted relative to the country. And so this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's like I said, it's more nuanced than just swing. So for example, between 2008 and 2012, basically the entire, and there's a number of big exceptions to this, but for the most part, the country moved towards Mitt Romney. But that wasn't to say that the whole country was trending right. It was just that Barack Obama won by a lot in 2008. He did okay in 2012, but he didn't get like a landslide type victory. So most of the country kind of reverted back to being a bit closer. And Mitt Romney, as a result, happened to do better in some places than John McCain. But in some areas, Romney did a lot better. He did maybe 12 or 15 points better. In other areas, he only did 1 point better. And so there's some value in saying, hey, even though the country got, say, 4% more favorable to Mitt Romney, this area got a lot more favorable to him. This area got more favorable to him by a very small amount. And so it allows you to kind of take a look at, or to look beyond just a swing that could have been influenced by a number of other factors, or could have just been influenced by like a national dynamic, and look at it more locally. But on the downside, what tends to happen, and you can actually see this on this map quite literally, is that the popular vote obviously doesn't determine who wins elections, and it's skewed by the bigger states, right? It is skewed by California, by Texas, by New York, by Florida, by Illinois, by Pennsylvania, by Ohio. And when you have that happening, it means that basically functionally what you're measuring is, and this isn't, obviously, because those states don't add up to like the majority of the American population, but really what you're measuring is how a candidate did relative to how they did in those states a little bit. It's not exact, but those states carry disproportionate weight, right? Losing 5% support in California is a ton of votes. Losing 5% support in Montana or North Dakota, not very many votes. No offense to Montana and North Dakota, but they just have fewer people than California. And so that's why you get skewed results. And that's why most of this map, despite the fact that this was not a good election for Kamala Harris or for the Democratic Party, most of this map is blue because most states move towards Trump by less than California, by less than New York, by less than Texas. And so let's talk about it now that we've kind of cleared that up. And this is not, but finally, this is not me saying like, oh, this is, the real way you should view the election. Because again, This map, more states trended towards Harris than did towards Trump. I'm not, spinning this as though I'm suggesting that Kamala Harris or that 2024 was a good election for Democrats because they, more states trended towards them. No, I am, just kind of highlighting this because I think it's important. So let's talk about it. The state that moved the most or that trended the most towards Harris was the state of Washington. The state that trended most towards Trump, I believe, was the state of New Jersey. And, it's interesting to look at, certainly. There are a couple of patterns. First of all, we saw that more diverse states trended more towards Donald Trump, right? I believe Hawaii, Texas, and California are three of the 4 or 5 most and when I say diverse, I mean racially diverse, or I should say ethnically diverse states. I think Hawaii is actually plurality Asian. Texas and California are, plurality non-white. Florida, another one, although that's that's more of you have a huge Hispanic voting bloc there. New York is a bit whiter, but it's still very diverse. New Jersey, same thing, a bit whiter, but you still have New Jersey is kind of interesting because you have pockets of Asian voters, you have pockets of black voters, Hispanic voters, and of course the state as a whole is still quite white. A couple exceptions, right? Like Tennessee, not super racially diverse, nor is Rhode Island, but again, you kind of get the idea. And even locally, you can see the swings, for example, in Massachusetts, they were a lot greater in the city of Boston than they were in the more white rural areas. Or in New York, it was a drastic difference between how New York City zoomed towards Trump, but upstate was pretty much didn't really move at all. In fact, there were some counties upstate where Kamala Harris outran Joe Biden, I believe. There were a couple. And then Texas, even I think there was 1 or 2 counties where Kamala Harris did better than Joe Biden. There were a couple where she didn't really do. It was like a 1 or 2 point drop. And then you go to the Rio Grande Valley, or you go to the more urban counties, right, like Dallas or Harris County, which is not named after Kamala Harris, but it's where Houston is. Those counties swung way towards Donald Trump. And so that's the first thing. Again, is that Donald Trump really. White voters in the 2024 election did not really move that much towards Trump. They did by roughly 1 to 2% based on most things I've read. You can look at the Pew report or the Catalyst report, narrowly swung towards Trump. But Hispanic voters big towards Trump. Black voters moved a little bit towards Trump on balance. Asian voters did move towards Trump nationally. And then kind of on the flip side of that, you can see that in the wider states, Kamala Harris held up quite well, right? Look at kind of this, going into the Mountain West, then going kind of into the Midwest over here with Minnesota and Wisconsin. These are states that are very white, not particularly diverse. Kamala Harris, because white voters didn't really move that much between 2020 and 2024, Kamala Harris held up well with them, or in these states rather. Washington kind of stands out as being extra blue. That's because it's for Democrats demographically quite good. It's still pretty white. Obviously, it's more diverse than Wyoming or Montana or the Dakotas, but it's still, I think, whiter than the country as a whole, although it might be a little close. And obviously, it's very college educated, and that's another thing that I'm going to point out, which is that voters who held college degrees were a lot less likely to swing towards Trump than voters who did not hold college degrees, per exit polling. And so, in states that had higher rates of education, or I should say higher rates of voters who held bachelor's degrees, at least, the swing towards Harris was the swing towards Trump, and by proxy, the trend towards Trump was a lot less pronounced. And again, that's kind of reflected in states like Washington that are very, educated, Oregon too, and then obviously some states were kind of broke with this. Like Massachusetts is actually a very educated state. It's still swung or still trended towards Trump. But broadly, it kind of held up. And then another thing you'll notice is that every single swing state, every single one of the, big 7, I guess you could say, like Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, those states all trended towards Kamala Harris. They all moved towards Harris. And what's interesting about that is that it kind of shows the strength of her campaign to an extent. Which is that even though the country as a whole swung against her, the interesting thing is that in these states where she campaigned, in the states where she spent a lot of time, she, was able to hold up relatively well. And that was especially the case in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. A bit less so in Nevada, Michigan, and Arizona. And again, you'll notice Nevada and Arizona, more so than the other five of the big seven, are, very, very Hispanic, right? Huge Hispanic voting blocks easily. And that was a big part of it, which is that across the country, Kamala Harris lost support with that voting block. And then Michigan is less diverse than North Carolina and Georgia, but is a bit more diverse, I believe, than Pennsylvania and definitely Wisconsin. And that played a role in that too. And so what we kind of saw was that Democrats were really not in a good position in this election. And, I think everyone knows that. Broadly, the perception of the economy among voters was really not good. Broadly, the just the global trend, and I don't love talking about global politics, comparing it to American politics, because it's not necessarily like my favorite comparison. But I think the the global trend is that incumbents post-COVID, post-2021, 2022 have really fared poorly. Very few incumbent governments have been reelected. And in the United States, obviously, on top of us not being an exception, we, saw a pretty big underperformance for the Democratic Party last year. And I think that manifested in states where there wasn't really a campaigner from either side, where there wasn't necessarily, people weren't paying attention, right? California, for example, Harris did not need to campaign in Los Angeles or San Francisco. She did not need to, fight hard for that state's 54 electoral votes. And that's, part of the beef with the Electoral College is that essentially the campaign focuses on very specific voters in very specific states. But like California, Florida, were not in play. Everyone knew Donald Trump was going to win Florida. Everyone knew Kamala Harris was going to win California. And ultimately, what we saw was that in those states where there wasn't really much competition, Democrats were decimated because there were no turnout operations. There were some, but they weren't funded by the party to the same extent. And there also just wasn't a ton of effort really put in. And that hurt Harris more than Trump. Whereas, go to Pennsylvania or North Carolina or Georgia, which were heavily contested, where, there were a ton of people, on both sides, but, a bit more so than Harris than Trump were the reports. A ton of people, working to get out the vote, advertising, and fighting in the final weeks. And I think Kamala Harris, had she won this election, it would have been entirely due to the not entirely due, but in part due to the superiority, of her ground game to Trump's. Because if you remember on election day in Philadelphia, tons of stuff for Kamala Harris, not a lot for Donald Trump. And again, that isn't a knock on Trump because he won the election, he won Pennsylvania, and it's certainly not a knock on his campaign because there were a lot of things I've said that the Trump campaign was very effective in doing. But I think in terms of ground game, to me, Kamala Harris, and you can see this in the swing states, was able to clear, that it did make a difference. It wasn't enough, but it really kept her in the ballgame, so to speak. So, just thought I'd kind of point this out. It's been 8 months since that election, so it's always good to come back. It's always good to think. Overall, more states did trend towards Harris. All the swing states did, but deeply concerning trends for the Democratic Party in New York, in Florida, in Texas, in Illinois, and California, and the popular vote, which for the past 8 to 10 years, I'd say really since 2016, has been thought of as this safe Democratic, thing that Democrats always win the popular vote. When you're losing in Los Angeles like that, when you're losing in New York like that, when you're losing in Miami like that, even in Chicago to an extent, really, really not good for you. And so, just very interesting to see. So, let me know what you want to see next. Let me know what you think about this type of video, and I'll see you all next time.